Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Fantastic to have you here. Welcome to Choosing the Right API Testing Solution. My name is Chris Colosimo. I'm the product manager here at Parasoft, and I am joined today by Ramiro Martinez. Ramiro and I are going to walk you through some criteria for understanding how to choose the right API testing solution. We'll be talking about what API testing is, some of the key areas that you need to focus when looking at a solution, and then give you some examples and walk you some critical capabilities that you need to focus on to maximize the success of your API rollout. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So first off, let's go ahead and talk through what is API testing. So API testing is when you have a series of components inside of your application, the ability to test and validate those individual components to ensure that they're functionally sound and semantically correct. While that's a little boring, I like to equate it to testing the plumbing in your house. So here we have a picture of a house, and you'll notice that there are a whole bunch of different pipes that are connecting all the different fixtures in this house. And so the idea behind API testing would be really similar to what a plumber would go through when they're testing the different components. So for example, in the bottom right-hand corner, we see that we have a little water heater here. It's designed to give us hot water. It takes cold water as an input, and it serves the whole house. This is really similar to a service that we may have inside of our application that has a specific function. And if I wanted to test the plumbing in this house, I would probably send some water to the water heater, let it do its thing, and then ensure that hot water came out. Right? So this is very similar to how we test our components. But it gets a little more complex than that. Notice that we have quite a few different fixtures in this house. We've got some sinks. There's a bath here on the second and the third floor. And just like in API testing, we want to ensure that all of these different components are tested, but work together in a meaningful way. An example of this would be to ensure that if I want to go upstairs and take a hot bath, that when I turn on that bath, it can call out to that water heater, get that hot water, and deliver it to the bath appropriately. This would be the same thing as doing somewhat of a scenario test. I also want to ensure that if I were to, say, flush the toilet during the part of getting the water into the bath, that I wouldn't get scalded. And this would be an example of how we might test various components in an integration test inside of our application. And then finally, one of the most important things when working with plumbing is to ensure that all of the different components of your house can get the appropriate amount of water at the same time. I don't want to turn on a faucet downstairs and not be able to use the sink upstairs. And this would be an example of how we would test our individual APIs under load and performance conditions. So that's just a little bit of an analogy, a story, if you will, about what API testing is. Now, when it comes to understanding the strategy of API testing, we look to the test pyramid here. So the test pyramid helps us understand the structure of our testing inventory. At the bottom, we want to build a solid foundation of code level or unit tests. And this really helps us identify the root cause of defects. But sitting right on top of that is a broad layer of API tests. And this is essential because I once heard API testing described as unit testing for QA. It's the first interface that we have onto our application that's potentially externally accessible. It consolidates a lot of the information and activity with our application into discrete interfaces. And it's essential to test at this layer because it helps us understand how our applications will be consumed from other business to business processes, but more importantly, how it's being consumed by the outside world. And sitting on top of this, we also have a foundation of automated UI tests, end-to-end tests, manual tests. And we want to definitely have those as a part of our strategy, but a decreased amount of those as compared to our granular API tests and unit tests. API testing is really important because it helps us to understand how the different components in our architecture are communicating with each other, both in isolation, which is vitally important when we start thinking about microservices, but also in conjunction so that we can understand that when we're adding new functionality to our applications, the individual components are all communicating the way that we expect. It serves as one of the best communication channels between your QA teams and your developer teams, because an API test can provide a really powerful artifact that can be understood by both QA and dev to help them reduce the time that it takes between discovering a defect and remediating that defect. And API tests are one of the best types of tests to create for automation because of their maintainability. Here's the thing, if API testing is the greatest thing in the world, how come we don't see it all the time? And that's because there's a little bit of confusion when it comes out there into who should be testing and how they should be testing. Since APIs are primarily machine readable, there's not really a GUI that sits on top of the API to help us understand what different actions and different interfaces do. So it's not immediately clear how we're supposed to interface with them, test them, use them in conjunction with each other. Quite often, like my house example here, we have to get a specialized plumber, right? Or a specialist in API testing to understand how to build meaningful API tests that can span all of our different SOAP or REST or even some of our more complicated services in a good way so that we can get that adequate coverage. And then finally, we see that API testing often falls into this no man's land. We recently ran some surveys and we asked developers and testers, who's responsible for API testing? And we saw that when we asked the testers, who should be doing API testing, development or test, we saw that about 60% of them were saying, well, the developers should be testing the APIs because it's their code and they wrote an interface. And so they know how it should work. And so as a part of development, they should be testing it. Well, interestingly enough, when we asked the same question of developers, about 65% said, no, testers should be testing the APIs. It's an externally accessible interface. We have a Swagger or a WSDL that's been documented, and they should be using that as a part of their end-to-end testing. So obviously we know that it's a combination of both that should be testing it. But again, there's a little bit of confusion out there as to who should be testing it. But the benefits are vastly outweighing the challenge with that. And with API testing, it becomes one of the most powerful techniques that you can have to validate your applications as early as possible. But there's some technical barriers associated with that. So that's why we get tools. And if we take an inventory of the different types of API testing solutions that are out there, they really fall into two categories. On the one hand, you have what we're going to refer to as the lightweight tools. These are typically your free or your open source tools. An example of this would be Postman. These tools are great because they allow you to get up and going really quickly, create very simple smoke tests, apply some very basic validations. We've often seen them used by development teams to, in an ad hoc way, test onto their applications. One of the best parts of these is, and a lot of them are free in the short term when it comes to testing them. Ultimately, when it comes to vendor support and maintenance, they become a little expensive. So folks often look to the other side of the spectrum, which would be enterprise tools. An example of this would be SOAP UI Pro, which we see here and there. These are great because they're big, powerful, vendor-supported tools that allow us to do the daily testing of our APIs, no matter what kind of technology that we have. They're comprehensive and they support workflows for teams, for scaling organizations. They're vendor supported, but some of the challenges that may be associated with these types of tools is that they can often be expensive, kind of heavy, difficult to use in a very ad hoc way. And so what you're really looking for is a combination of these two different types of solutions. You want to be able to do all of the things required for your API testing requirements, but still have a solution that's easy to use by the organization, is easy to adopt and easy to scale. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through some of the capabilities that you need to have in your API testing solution. We're going to outline them in a nice list format that you can then take and do. So to do that, I'm going to have Ramiro come in here and talk us through some of these required features and capabilities.
So first, let's take a look at ease of use and capability. So the way I like to think of this is the two different users. You have a novice that comes in. You want the tool to be able to be picked up easily and start the API testing. But you also want the tool to be powerful enough that in 6 months, when they're starting to work with more complex customer stories and really complex scenarios, that the tool can handle it, that the tool has the features that helps them do that. So first, you want the tool to be visual and not require any type of scripting. So it can be handled more, it can be handled easier, and it can be easier to pick up. But at the same time, even though you don't necessarily require a script, sometimes you need to make something custom, something that's completely different than what you're expecting. And that's where the second one comes in. You want to be able to extend your solution. Don't want to be stuck with what you have out of the box, but be able to expand upon that, add to it as needed. And then the third one is you want to be able to do assertions. What's the point of a test if it's not validating something? You want your regression test to be able to double check and make health checks and all types of configurations to validate something. And then you want to be able to scale your solution. You want your scenarios to not be working in a static values of one set of data being passed through. You want to be able to go through these Excel files that you've created over time that have all types of scenarios that need to be passed through. So you want to be able to make sure that your solution can handle data-driven testing. And you want your test to be reusable. What time are you really saving if every single time you want to run this test, you have to recreate it? So your scenario, your API testing solution has to have testing reusability. Otherwise, it really is pointless. And then you want ways to make your test quickly. If you're having to go and F12 in your Chrome browser every single time you want to get your API testing going, then you're not really saving time either. You want something to help you get jump started on your testing. And then the last one is authentication. There isn't really an organization that's going to have a bunch of APIs or their protocols that are just completely empty. There would no authentication. You want your solution to be able to support your SSL. You want it to support your OAuth 1 or 2, or your Kerberos, or whatever might be coming up in the future. You want your API to, you need your API testing solution to have that capability. Chris, is there anything you'd like to add here?
No, I think this is good. So in this category, what you're essentially pointing out are the activities that you need your API testing tool to be able to do in order to comprehensively test your application from a capabilities perspective, so that you can make maximum effort or usage of each individual test that you're creating. Okay.
Exactly. And second, we have optimized workflows. And these are features and functionality that helps you perform the actions you're going to be doing tons of times easier. You want to be able to streamline those actions. So, for example, test logic. You want to be able to. You don't want your test scenario to be simple. A lot of times you're going to have to go down different workflows depending on what type of information you're getting back. And to do this, you don't have to create a completely new TST every single time, because also it fails in half the times. What you want is an easy a feature that allows you to easily implement if, then, or looping as needed into your scenarios. Additionally, even though it's kind of a sticky, you want AI-powered test creation. And I know AI is a bit of a sticky term. You're not sure of it, but it's 2019. You really want a way to boost your test creation. You really want a way to really boost your functionality when creating these API tests. And that's where AI can help us in helping us create something that we can then scale and automate into our CI pipelines. And that's what it's there for. And then you want a way to manage your data and generate your data. You want your API testing solution to help you. If you need to make a completely new string every single time you're running your test, you want your API testing solution to have that functionality. You want it to you're going to be dealing with data all the time in massive amounts of it. So you need your testing solution to have some capacity of modifying it and helping you deal with that information. And then we come down to the last one here, which is BDD or Cucumber support. And this really comes down to what other types of users you might, or other types of knowledge you need for your use cases. Business analysts have a great idea of what's going on with the customer stories or what's expected of your business implementation of this application, and you want their input. And so BDD support allows you to have that input and create test scenarios directly from that capability. there anything you'd like to add, Chris?
No, I think that's a great overview. So the column on the left, ease of use and capability, are those activity or action, features and capabilities that we need in our API testing solution to be able to make our meaningful scenarios. What you're saying here is that the column here, optimized workflows, these are the things we're going to do every day and are going to be one of the most critical components. And so our API testing solution must have optimized workflows for those things that we do on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
And third, we have supported technologies, which is a big list. It's a big list, but if you look through it, I bet you start to recognize some things there. So you have your REST and your SOAP and MQ and JMS, and these are all things you probably use on a daily basis you're very familiar with. And you need your API testing solution to have these because they're very common in terms of what your application is going to be dealing with. But at the same time, you don't know what you're going to have to work with tomorrow. At one point, JMS was the newest technology, or MQ was the new thing you had to learn, and you need to find a tool for it. And maybe or maybe not your API solution had it. So with this capacity, you don't know what's coming up tomorrow. Maybe you need to support Kerberos. You come in, your organization says microservices, that's a feature. Find a tool, give me Kerberos. I need it now. And it's like, well, I need my tool to be able to, I need to be secure that this list is taken care of because I really don't know what I'm going to have to see tomorrow.
Excellent. So supported technologies become important in covering multiple aspects of our application. This is kind of an interesting thing that you and I were talking about. We're seeing that API testing as a term is being somewhat overloaded in the industry. Typically, when we say API testing, we think REST, SOAP, those kind of APIs. But really, API testing is now being expanded to include things like microservices, IoT, Kafka, RabbitMQ, even databases in some cases fall under that same blanket. And so you need an API testing solution that can test all of these different things, including web in a lot of cases, because it's a part of the testing scenario. Okay.
Yeah, exactly, Chris. So next, we have automation, because really that's the final goal. That's the goal we want with these tests we're creating. We want them to run when we need them to run, and as nightly tests or as a build on or test on build, we need these to be available to us when necessary. So we have you need to have your API testing solution to have some capacity of integration with your CI pipeline. You need to be able to add these in so they run exactly when you need them to run. And hopefully you have some type of plugin that you can then add to these applications you're using for execution. So you want these plugins to be available for you to easily plug in your application to be able to work together with your Jenkins or your TeamCity. Additionally, you want some form of additional types of execution. So your CI, your command line execution, you want it to be able to just pop it into the command line, execute it, get your results, have your report generated, be able to check it out and make sure everything's running correctly. Very quick and easy without being obtrusive, everything being in the background. Or if you're more mature in terms of technology, you want an API, you want your testing solution to have some capacity for API execution, grabbing reports, setting up scenarios. You want that functionality to be there because you really don't know if you're going to be using these pre-built systems for execution or for your CI pipeline. You might be using something completely different, and you want to have some capacity of integration there as well, something that allows you to do something a little more custom. And also, we have no idea what's going to be in the future of DevOps. We want to be able to handle it now, no matter what it's going to be.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the ones that, if we're really looking to check boxes as we're analyzing our API testing tool, we need these boxes checked. Automation comes in different flavors for everybody. It could be as simple as command line execution and nightly or weekly matter, or we could be building an entire DevOps pipeline where we want to be able to interact with the tool via open APIs and really integrate it into our system. And so focusing our capabilities when we're choosing a tool on ease of integration, native functionality that's built in. Would you say that these are some of the most critical capabilities that we need to focus on?
Extremely so.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so last but not least, we have what a lot of what we're creating on the left-hand side hinges on, and that's maintenance and management. You want to be able to manage everything you've been creating, be able to set it up in certain ways, be able to integrate these with your requirement manager, such as AOM or Jira. And at the same time, you want all of this to be maintained because which becomes the cost of API testing is be able to make sure that all your API tests are up to date and working as intended. So from the very beginning, a lot of times you're going to want these tests to be linked up with your requirement manager so you can give development a better idea of what's going on and how exactly the scenario works and what is expected for a behavior to occur. And you can give them much better detail with an API test. Additionally, once you have these tests being created and they're being ran, you want to know what's going on with them. You want some type of reporting system. You want the reporting system to be easy to read and take a look at and find out if something went wrong or how many failures you have. But at the same time, you want it to be verbose. So you want to have the ability to dig into it and see what exactly went wrong if you see some type of errors. And then once all of that has been constructed, a lot of these tests are working together. They're integrated. There are a lot of them for the same environment, for the same infrastructure. So you want to be able to build these tests together. And that's where test orchestration comes in, where you're building these tests, and you're linking them together to create these much larger, much more complex scenarios out of smaller things you've created beforehand. And then all these tests should be accessible for all your teams. You want these to be easily accessible from a browser to be able to learn from them and be able to execute them on the fly as needed. And then one of the ones I find most important is once you've created all these tests and you've created all these amazing scenarios, you don't want them to be vulnerable to change. You want to be able to quickly adapt to change when it occurs and get your environment back to a stable point. So you need your API testing solution to have some type of change management to be able to handle change as it occurs, because it's going to a lot of time.
Excellent. And yeah, thanks, Ramiro. I mean, this is a super comprehensive list. Just to let everybody know, as a follow-on item to this webinar, we're going to be sending you a document that outlines every single one of these capabilities as a checklist. We've worked to give you a detailed explanation for what each of these capabilities are, so you can take it back to your organization and you can discuss it. All API testing tools that are out there should have all of these capabilities. But to really take your API testing solution to the next level and to maximize the ROI, we've put together a list of 4 critical capabilities that you must focus on in your API testing solution. The first one is rapid test creation. This is important because as APIs explode, the API economy is just absolutely exploding at an exponential rate at this time. More APIs are showing up, partner APIs, business-to-business APIs. We need to be able to have a technology that can help us build the proper set of API tests that are satisfying all of the different requirements we have for all the different types of testing we want to do: smoke, regression, integration, performance, in the time frames that are given to us from Agile, which are compressed. And so rapid test creation is an essential capability, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Additionally, breadth of technology. Now, Ramiro touched on this a little bit, but the idea is that we don't know what the future of application technology or interfaces looks like right now. We know that things are changing, from the standard RESTful interfaces that just recently changed from SOAP into our reactive services for microservices. And so you need a solution that can not only support everything that exists now, but also has something to support you as things change. Another key capability that your API testing tool must have is a broadly accessible architecture. API rollouts thrive on ease of use and ease of access, but they can fall and become dormant when your team can't get access to the solution. And so you need to have a mechanism where you can easily distribute the solution, access the solution, and collaborate through the solution in order to maximize the adoption at your organization. And then as Ramiro alluded to at the end, change management is one of the most critical capabilities you have to laser focus on when choosing your API testing solution. Because if you get all of the other pieces right, you're going to build a huge library of test cases. And change then becomes an extremely disruptive force. And so having built-in capabilities to get ahead of that is going to be critical for your solution. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each one of these capabilities and give you some real-life scenarios, talk about some challenges, and then give you an example of how we here at Parasoft have approached the solution to these challenges to help you when you're trying to make your decision with your tool. So let's start with rapid test creation. A lot of time is lost in creating API tests with expanding API inventories. Our applications, as I said earlier, are powered by those APIs, and a lot of our interfaces may use undocumented APIs. And so what we see is that there's a little bit of a challenge when determining how to build those API tests and what the right API tests are. Basically, what we see a lot of organizations struggle with is that their application gets new features and functionality. They're given the full stack application, which really behind the scenes is a series of both internal, external, and third-party APIs. But then when the team or the leader says, hey, it's time to test these APIs so you can get your coverage, it kind of looks like this, right? It would be really difficult to put a puzzle together if you didn't actually know what the picture on the pieces were. But that's really what an API, I mean, sure, we get our documentation for it. But what we're looking for is a way to simplify and create simple tests in a very rapid period of time. So Ramiro, can you talk us through how we might approach that?
Absolutely, thank you, Chris. So there's a few different ways you can tackle this this challenge. And SOA tests, with SOA tests, very obviously you can do you can create API tests using a service definition such as WSDL or Swagger. But this is kind of basic. Really, if your API testing solution does not have this, it's missing some key functionality already, and you want to try to take a look at that. A little bit the way we've taken a look at that, and that problem of not understanding what's going on in the API side, not knowing what exactly they do, is the SOA Test Smart API Test Generator. And what it does is, as you're doing your manual test with your web page, APIs are being ran, and that data is there. And what we do is we grab that traffic. We then send that traffic over to SOA Test and then leverage AI to identify patterns and establish data relationships between these different APIs that are being called to create these API templates, which then can become our test scenarios, which can then be scaled larger, or many times we'll have assertions already, but you can add assertion to it if something is more pinpoint to what you recognize as necessary. So you can begin to create larger API scenarios and also learn what your API is doing, have a better understanding how exactly data is being transferred. I mentioned earlier the data relationship, but it's extremely important to know when I call one API, what's expected of the second one? What exactly? A lot of times I'll create a bunch of APIs from API tests from a Swagger, and I'm like, I don't know how these link together. And that's what this tool is here to help you with. And that's what you want from your testing API solution, is an ability to understand your API along with be able to test it. And you want all these tests to be repeatable, because otherwise it's pointless. So, and be able to add these to your CI pipeline. So what we're doing is we're going to be creating these API scenarios, and then we have the capacity to not have to do our manual testing. While manual testing is still important, and you're definitely going to be able to doing it still, it's important to be able to have some test cases that can be added to your CI pipeline to start doing automation, scaling it up with the data sources you have already.
Excellent. So, so that's one way that we here at Parasoft have approached the challenge of rapid test creation. But as you're working your way through your checklist, make sure that's one of the first things that you're focusing on. Does this work for my organization? Does this give me the ability to rapidly create test cases given the technology that I have? Is it leveraging something like Ramiro said? Are we leveraging something like AI to help optimize our test creation process? Okay, so our second area that we want to focus on here is breadth of technology. So again, we'll do the same thing here. The challenge that we see when it comes to testing across multiple interfaces in your application is the cost of understanding and researching and learning different technologies and different pieces to test each one of these different interfaces. You know, we see a lot of free or open source solutions that are out there, and these are great, but one of the challenges associated with them is that the way that you create a test in Appium for mobile or Selenium for web is different than the way that you would create an API test for Postman. And so the QA teams are going out there and doing a very immense job of educating themselves on all of the different techniques. And then things completely change when you get a reactive microservice, or you get some kind of you know, TCP-based or file-based operation with your application. And you have to have all these different tools that you have, and you also need to maintain and orchestrate as a part of your solution. And one of the other major challenges that we see from that is all of the different reports that come out of that, and consolidating them into some meaningful definition for leadership to help us understand where we are. So this is the challenge that we have of our applications. How might we solve this with our API testing solution?
Thanks, Chris. What it comes down to is applications aren't simple anymore, and they haven't been for a long time now. So you need a API testing solution that deals with more than just APIs. It's the simple truth. Your API testing solution should be able to handle and support all types of functionality and protocols. So you should be able to add your mobile test to your API solution, API test cases you've already created, and link those together. So when they execute, they're working together. And you need to be able to add your web functional test, which you're going to definitely have as well, and be able to add that in as well, and API, and then maybe databases as well. You want to be able to link all these together because the API isn't simple. The API is complex in terms of it's a web now. It's a web that needs to work together to be able to truly showcase what a customer is going to be going through when they're using your application. Additionally, you don't know what's going to come out in the future. And so you want an API testing solution that can handle or provide you a list that really shows you the broad of, makes you comfortable with what might be coming up. So when it comes up, you feel secure. For example, Parasoft extensibility framework allows us to add functionality as needed. So a lot of times for example, when microservices came out, we saw that was something that was expanding, and we had our development team create a tool using the same tools that you actually will have available to you to create, to add functionality to SOA test. And that assures you that we're going to keep up to date, and you want your API testing solution to keep up to date to what's the new hotness. And also, you want to be able to deal with it yourself as well. A lot of times, you need to go even faster than what's currently available. So you might turn to something a little more lightweight, like a TCP protocol. And then you want something custom, a completely different message format. You want an API testing solution that does not limit you to what's in the box. You want to be able to add to it, add new tools to your toolbox as needed.
So basically what we're saying here is there's a lot of things to test. There's a lot of different interfaces. And so when you're choosing your API testing solution, you want to make sure that you understand the entire inventory that your organization will support from an interface, message format, and protocol perspective. And here at Parasoft, how we've solved that challenge is by simply supporting over 120 plus message formats and protocols out of the box, as well as a series of different types of interfaces. That way, you can focus on making sure that your technology has what you're looking for. Okay, broadly accessible architecture. So this one is key. This is one of the challenges that you'll see as you move forward with your API testing solution, and that is one of scaling. When organizations start looking at API testing, quite often they'll choose a tool, maybe from one team, a different tool for another team, and they'll each have their own standards and best practices for how to use the tool. But the challenge that we see from that is as we grow and start building more and more business critical API tests, there's a lot of overlap because one team is testing a critical component that may be shared by another team. And each of those API tests may be in a different solution, maybe in different source control systems. And then what happens is as different team members come and go in the organization. They take the knowledge with them. And a lot of those test cases have to be rebuilt. Also, we see that QA struggles to understand the necessary technology in whichever tool they created, as well as getting access to the solution. So seeing this picture, we have two different mentalities. We have a team here on the bottom that really wants to use a desktop application, something super powerful to create their tests, while at the same time, there are many developers and different testers that want to use a browser-based solution. And so the challenge is collaborating and making that a reality for those different teams. So how might we approach that?
So here, there's a few different ways of doing it, but the way Parasoft is looking to help a team with collaboration is by providing a platform where people are able to work together, whether that be a different team or the same team. In this case, we have Parasoft Continuous Testing Platform, which is a powerful thin client, which perfectly integrates with our SOA test, what's been created with SOA test, and provides you a repository of tests and artifacts that we can then utilize for both running our executing our tests, but also learning from the rest of the people that are using the application with this. For example, I might be in development, and I create a health check for my database, and that's running fine, and I'm good. I was able to quickly create that by going onto my browser and just made my test, and now it's sitting on a repository for when I need it later. And now I'm a QA member. I'm on a QA team, and I need to do some testing on my database, and I don't know how to do it. But what I have is a repository of tests I can then look at and see if I can learn from them to get a better idea of what exactly is expected, because a lot of the domain knowledge of our application, of our database, that ownership a lot of times is in development. So I want to learn from them. And a lot of times that interaction can take some time. So by seeing what's been done already, by learning from what artifacts are been completed and then configured and saved onto this repository and into this thin client, I can then learn and get a jump start on what exactly I need to do. Additionally, we highly recommend that you have some type of source control integrated with your system and have a process that allows you to add your artifacts as they're completed into the source control. And this really helps boost a team, because the newest members are coming in are getting jump started, a couple steps to kind of understand better what's going on. They have a library of already pre-configured tests that kind of show them how exactly API testing even works. Maybe I come in and I don't understand how OAuth 2.0 sends in the authentication. I can go on Google and look around for a day and a half and kind of figure it out and finally get some type of API test going and figure out why it was not working. Or I can see what's already been created. I can see, oh, okay, John already figured this out, and I can kind of get an idea of how it works. I can see I just got to add it to the header, and I'm good to go now. I can have my API test going much faster and allowing this collaboration, and which is beautiful because it doesn't have to interfere with another person on the team. I'm able to learn from them without actually having to go and take some of their time and take some of my time doing it. We can build upon each other, kind of creating these larger and larger complex scenarios by being able to work together, different teams or different members, building something and learning from what they've done, and then the vice versa, really building upon each other. And then going past that into different positions. As a QA, I'm learning from the development by their test cases, but at the same time, I'm learning when I create my scenario, I can then provide that as a direct link to development to be able to reproduce some behavior, making both teams faster and what they're able to understand and see what behaviors occurring with their application. And all of this is backed up with some type of version control. By being able to commit our test artifacts there, we're able to have a backup that can be provided as necessary. If something is unstable, we can check it back a little bit, find out what's going on, and we're back to being stable. So it's important to have something that both supports collaboration, but also supports the ability to feel safe with our application.
All right, excellent. So I think the takeaway from this one is that the solution should be accessible as both a browser and as a desktop application, whatever whatever the users need, they should be able to get access to that. So look to the API testing solutions that give you that flexibility. And then additionally, as Ramiro pointed out here, version control, native support for version control is essential. Without version control, it's going to be really difficult to collaborate, as well as having that consolidated platform that holds all the different testing artifacts for you to use. That's really going to help you solve that scaling challenge as you move forward into the future. So I think the final thing here, and arguably most important, is change management. And as we kind of pointed out before, change in our APIs can be one of the most disruptive forces to our API testing practice. And what ends up happening is that as we're working with our applications, the APIs in there may change, or the changes may be somewhere external to us. And every single time one of these changes takes place, our research indicates that it takes about 2 to 6 weeks for most organizations to refactor their API testing library for every single one of those changes. And so what does this do? Ultimately, this ends up slowing down our testing cycles, which slows down our releases. And it's really about having this change understandable to us so that we can figure out a path forward. So our solution must do something to support that. So how would we approach that challenge?
So you need to be able to scale your maintenance and your change. When I was in college, I worked in a warehouse, and it got very hot. But actually, the most frustrating part was having to just do the same thing over and over again. I'd take something out of a box and put it in a different box and put it next to a bunch of other boxes, and that was my day for 8 hours. And it was really the most frustrating part. And that's kind of what happens when something changes in your service side. I have to go through every single one of my tests and then make my changes one by one and try to look and comb through and try to find what exactly needs to be modified. I'm doing that over and over again. And that's what you want your API testing solution to help with, is trying to minimize that. And there's a few different ways of doing that. One of them that we ourselves implement at Parasoft is be able to reuse common test steps. We want these modules that can be fitted into multiple test scenarios, and because a lot of times you're going to be using the same type of tools over and over again with a lot of the same configuration. So we want to be able to make one change and change all those tools. So instead of modifying a single tool 100 times, you're modifying 100 tools with one change. Additionally, when you have your test cases, you want to be able to do an analysis. A lot of these tests are being created with the service definition in mind. So we provide a capacity for be able to perform an analysis on 2 different service definitions, be able to make the changes once with our templates. These templates can then be used to refactor a whole bunch of tests, a bulk of them, hundreds of tests at the same time. Any one of them that's using that surface definition can be changed. So you're scaling up your maintenance, your changes at one point, at one time. So you're not having to make, as I said, 100 changes one at a time, but one change to 100 different places.
Excellent. Yeah, change management, as we see it, I mean, if you're really just going to focus on one critical capability, I would say, in addition to automation, change management is one of the most critical ones that can be super disruptive to your growth. So your API testing solution, you need to make sure that you're focusing on that. So getting towards the end of the webinar here, so I will encourage anybody that has any questions to go ahead and throw them into the box. But let's do a little too long didn't read, right? So if you were surfing the web, maybe a little busy during this webinar, let's sum it up. Every API testing tool should have the following capabilities: an ease of use and capability. It should be easy to use. You should be easy to understand how to do these certain activities. It should have optimized workflows for those things you do all the time. It should support a wide range of technologies, both included by your company and those that you're looking to get into. It should be easy to automate. And it should have some sort of management or maintenance capability. And if you're going to focus on some capabilities here, the ones to maximize the ROI from your API testing tool, you want to focus on your rapid test creation, potentially using something like AI, breadth of technology, looking to support non-standard protocols or newer emerging technologies such as IoT and microservices. Broadly accessible architecture, something that helps us collaborate, share, get access to the solution, regardless of our approach, and then change management. And to really help you make this decision easier, SOATest actually has all of these capabilities built in. And so I will encourage you to grab this checklist, use this as a guide as you're moving through your decision-making process when choosing an API testing solution, and help it facilitate the conversations with your team, with different vendors or partners that you're working with to make sure that you're getting the right API testing tool for your organization. So let's move on to some questions here, but for more information on Parasoft SOATest, go ahead and head to the link software.parasoft.com/try and get yourself access to Parasoft SOATest, or ask us any questions that you may have. So the first question here is saying, can you explain the analogy in the enterprise world? Who should do what? So I think what they're referring to there is at the beginning, I said that there was confusion about who should do API testing, development or test. And I said it should be both. And so what he's saying is, well, how does that actually work at a large enterprise organization, right? What's the governance around determining who should be doing the API testing? And so I'm going to give a light answer to that and then point you to a much bigger article that I've written on this. But the idea is that there's different types of API testing that you do. Early stage or shift left API testing, where we're doing our smoke and our regression, maybe our schema validation, should be done by development. It should be done as those APIs are created to ensure that a client can create, a client can be created to consume them, and that the responses are semantically correct, the WSDLs are written in a proper way, everything designed at integrating with this API works. And then when it comes to actually deploying the application and validating the functionality, those initial tests can now be leveraged by QA. And QA can build functional tests to validate API usage, and integrating the different pieces together, as well as shifting that into performance testing. So that's kind of where I draw the line. Different organizations shift a little bit left or right. There's a blog on the Parasoft blog called "What is API Testing?" And basically talks through all the different types of techniques and who should do what. Next question, can we have an example of using AI for testing? Yeah, so I'll talk to this first and then you want to add any color to it. We were saying that AI is a really powerful tool that's available now because of where we are in technology that can be leveraged in solutions like Parasoft SOATest or potentially other solutions that are out there. In our example, the AI was used to understand the patterns and relationships between different test steps in your API scenario. And the example that Ramiro gave was that the application was making calls to the backend system. Those calls were then captured, and then it went beyond record and playback by looking at the different API calls, the different payloads that were delivered, looking for patterns. What's related to each other? Are there IDs that are being exchanged? Is there state? How may I start building an assertion on that? And that's how our technology works, and it leverages AI for that. But there are other practical examples that you should look for. What we were pointing out was that AI in our technology is a way to help you solve the rapid test creation challenge, which is the thing you really want to focus on when choosing your API testing solution. Want to add anything to that?
No, that's exactly correct. And I really want to emphasize on the tool portion of this. It's not necessarily that your AI is completely replacing what needs to be done. It's allowing you to get to a place where you can do the more complex scenario. It allows you to take you to a place where you can start to scale your API testing, so you're not bogged down by the hidden, being blind to the APIs. You now have an idea of what's going on, and you can build upon that. So it's an emphasis on the tool portion of it, that it helps you expand what you're going to be doing.
Thank you for that, Ramiro. Here's a good question. We have 4 test environments. Does this tool support running the same tests against multiple environments, not having to make 4 copies of each test for each new environment? I'll let you handle that one.
Absolutely. Built into your test, you can set different environments. So you can have QA environment, dev environments, and test environments. And all these can be completely separate, but within the same TST or the same test scenario. So switching between them is literally just a right click and a left click. You're able to switch and immediately go to a different environment, and you can link these together to run as well. So able to go through all your environments at once.
Thanks for that. How do you leverage your tool to test across multiple browsers and mobile devices efficiently? So I'll talk in general terms about the solution, but essentially we have things like Selenium grids. We have organizations that focus on the delivery of mobile devices in the cloud. AWS, Sauce Labs, Experitest does a great job at this. SoaTest is an API testing solution, focuses on APIs. Now, mobile tests call a lot of APIs as they're being executed. And so there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. If you actually want to run the mobile test, we have some capability built into our solution. But more importantly, what you want to do is you want to capture or understand the API calls that are actually being made, and then test those directly. And then at that point, it doesn't actually matter the browser version or the mobile device that you're on. That's handled as a part of your mobile testing strategy. Here's a good question. How does SoaTest support API scalability, and how to address the API evolution within the enterprise? I just like the way that question sounds. So APIs change, right? And we talked about that towards the end. And as an organization, we want to be able to have a process where we understand what APIs are available to us. And so that is in gathering up our documentation. And as Ramiro was talking about at the beginning, building tests from our service definitions, using in our case, the API or the AI-powered recording to grab all the undocumented APIs and just get a nice inventory of what APIs we have. We can build smoke and regression tests against those to understand our current state, and then use change management workflows to understand as our APIs change and scale, what areas incrementally we need to focus on in order to cover those API resources. How does this solution integrate with Virtualize? They're the same, they're sister products. SoaTest is our API testing solution. Virtualize is our API virtualization solution. They're two sides of a phone call. Anything that you would do here in SoaTest, you could then create a mock service or a virtual service inside of Parasoft Virtualize. They integrate by literally living in the same application, in the same program. Can I use this tool for UI and API automation? Yes. Yes, UI is a piece of API testing because you may want to gather up data as you're executing through your UI. So while your API testing solution should not strictly have UI testing in it, it's pretty great if it does. And that will help you create those omni-channel tests. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah, and also you can switch between browsers and all types of things in that capacity. And a lot of the functionality that I spoke about in API, you can actually bring that into your UI test as well.
Is this an AI solution? It is. It leverages AI to help optimize your testing strategy. Hi team, unable to see the words. Can you please read the letter after test? Under optimized workflows, the next category was AI-powered test. What source control systems are currently supported by Parasoft? GitHub, SVN, question mark? Yes, GitHub, yes, SVN, yes, ClearCase, yes, anything that you can natively support inside of Eclipse. And we also have the ability with our WAR or our highly available deployment to use any command line or batch scripts to pull down source control systems that you may have in Bitbucket, GitLab, so on and so forth. So many, many source control systems. Can we do any artificial intelligence with API testing? What about Internet of Things for API testing? Not quite sure I understand the question. Can we do artificial intelligence with API testing? But you can use API testing to validate any applications that you have that may produce APIs such as chatbots, so on and so forth, and also use artificial intelligence in your testing. IoT, the supported protocols that we're seeing a lot on the API side are things like MQTT, WebSockets, Rabbit. I think some of them are escaping my mind, but go to parasoft.com and take a look at our IoT page, and we'll give you a detailed breakdown of IoT testing and the different capabilities. I think we're good. Thank you, everybody, and you guys have a great day, and we'll see you in the next webinar.